Welcome to the Digital Clinic, the podcast that goes deep on critical digital marketing trends, strategies, and tactics for the healthcare and medical device industries. Each episode brings you expert guests sharing the knowledge, insights, and advice that healthcare marketers need to be successful in this complex and rapidly evolving digital landscape. With me today is Laura Chase, who previously was Director of Web Analytics and Insights at Providence and has joined Wheelhouse recently as Senior MarTech Strategist. Laura, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I actually am really looking forward to this because you have such an amazing background and I get to ask you questions about your background. I've never printed out anyone's LinkedIn before to ask them questions, but I want to know about everything you've done. So if you don't mind, let's start at the beginning-ish.
Okay.
Let's go back to Adobe and what you did at Adobe and kind of march forward.
Yeah.
And in particular, I'm interested in what you learned along the way that gave you the perspective that you have now.
Yeah. So I fell into analytics. It wasn't a thing that you studied for. There wasn't an analytics job at the time, right? This was like the early 2000s, like 2001. And I fell into it where I was working for a backcountry. We were using HIPAA at the time. They were just moving over to Omniture. I was doing order analysis and working for the finance department. Taught myself SQL, and the marketing team found out that I knew SQL. And they were like, well, hey, we have some questions for you. And so that's when I started, I was like, okay, we're going to use this HIPAA data. And we're going to tie that to our, to our database data that we've got with all these SQL queries, and we're going to do that. And so then we're migrating over to Omniture. I found out Omniture was my backyard at that point, and I thought, this stuff is awesome. So went over to Omniture, had a great time. But you kind of ask about my perspective, what changed how I think about analytics. And I think that's when I was there and I was a business analyst, right? Purely business analyst. We're running reports, we're doing analysis for clients. And I just couldn't make heads or tails of the data because there's this data, but I don't know what it means. I don't know how it's being collected. I don't know how it's being processed. I'm just getting the output, but I don't know exactly what that output means. So if I'm joining columns of data, or back in the day, evars and props, if I'm using this data, I don't know what exactly that means. Is it a click? Is it a load? What is that? And at that time, I think it's still the beginning of analytics, digital analytics. They had, there were technical implementation, analysts, and they were on one side. They were like the developers. And then you had your business analysts, and they didn't really talk to each other. And I think that at that point, that's where I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. I need to understand how the data works so I know how to use the data. So I did a deep dive into the tech side. Had a really good friend I got hired with who was on the tech side and taught me everything. And it was awesome. So I figured out how to do the implementation, and then I figured out, talking again with different consultants, with different product managers, how the data was being processed, and the light went on. I was like, oh, okay. So that totally makes sense to me now of what I'm collecting and how that spat on the other side. And now I can make sense of this data. And so, I was probably there a couple years at what became Adobe before I figured that out. But I think that was probably the biggest thing that swayed how I think about data. Yeah. And now even, how many years later and running teams, this is the first thing I'll do with my analysts is check, they've got some great SQL knowledge. They've got some, they've got some great Python. Do they understand the data that they're using? And then going back and working backwards and making sure that they understand, like if you're a digital analyst, you really, really need to understand your data collection. Can you open a debugger? Like you've got great scripting skills. So if you can, if you can do SQL, if you can do Python, you can do JavaScript. And so we'll work backwards and we look at that data collection and then we go forward. And I want to say walking that hybrid line between tech and business, it's opinionated. I feel like it's made me a better analyst, but I've also seen my analysts that have worked for me. And once they can walk that road in between tech and business, they become better analysts, but they also become I want to say better storytellers, or they start to understand the business more because they're like, this is capable, this is not capable. Oh, can we collect that piece of data that my business stakeholder needs? Well, how do I collect that so I'm actually answering their business question, not just throwing some smoke and mirrors at it?
Yeah. So what was the company you were at that was acquired by Adobe?
So it was Omniture, way back in the day.
So I did not know that.
Yeah. Omniture was it was based in Utah, and I was working out of Park City, and Omniture was out of Orange, just through the mountains.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think, well, I know one of the co-founders of Omniture is also behind Domo now.
Yes, and the other one is Observe Point.
Yes. I didn't realize the other was Observe Point.
Yes.
Yes, that's
John
interesting.
Piston. I met him at their Edge, kind of like their summit event.
Yeah.
And awesome company.
Yeah.
Awesome company.
Yeah. I met him years ago as well when I was running marketing for a company that
Yeah.
won an award where Omniture also was winning an award. Yes. Interesting guy. Yeah.
Yes.
So from there then to Overstock,
Yeah.
where I assume, again, it was all about answering the business question.
Yeah. Well, I had started, so I did Adobe consulting about 5 or 6 years, went to Singapore with Adobe. Mostly I was working with banks in Singapore, right? I was in finance and banking. Worked with all the big banks, all of them. And I was working with Citibank, and I actually got to know the New York team, Long Island, New York team, while I was in Singapore. So I was on midnight calls with New York while I was in Singapore. So after I moved back to the States, I actually worked with Citibank. And again, I think that was, every experience kind of, creates how do you think about things. And I was working with the global team. And that was really, really interesting. I think that's when I started thinking about, hey, there's different digital maturities, because I'm working with all different countries, right? Some of them, we had Australia, and they were like, at the time, they were doing A/B testing and optimization and trying to automate as much stuff as they could. And others were talking about building a website, what it takes to build a website.
Sure.
Do you have an app? And hey, have you heard of analytics? So we had the whole gamut of like immature to mature. And then how do you move organizations from knowing nothing and that education to move little by little by little by little to get into a mature organization?
And so from there to T-Mobile?
Yep. Yeah. So I did the Overstock, just kind of a layover. My family was tired of me traveling international. I love traveling international.
Yeah.
I had toddlers. So my husband at the time did not love my international travel.
Yeah.
So I had worked for a year for Overstock. Again, they're in e-commerce, and it was kind of fun to go, okay, I started in e-commerce. I went as a consultant, worked in all the different industries, grounded in financial services. Financial services at the time, slow, behind the curve, slow adopters, conservative. You want your banks conservative. That was fine. I was like, hey, we're happy with being conservative. And then jumping back into e-commerce going, oh my gosh, we're running pace again.
Yeah.
So that was fun to just kind of go, oh wait, now we're going really fast. And to really, I want to say that's probably the time I got really into A/B testing. Because I was running both teams. I had the analytics team and the A/B testing team. I think that was the part where I said, hey, what was really cool about having both of those teams was saying with an analytics team, it's really easy just to become a reactive BI reporting team. And the value isn't really seen in that, right? You're a cost center. You're not a profit center. So it's like, well, how do we change that conversation so an analytics team becomes a profit center instead of a cost center? And that was by doing some of the analysis to make recommendations to the product managers or the stakeholders about, hey, we're seeing an area we could optimize. We want to test that. And they had a testing culture, which was great. It was already a mature testing culture. And so that's where you could get that cycle going of every insight should lead to a test. Every test should lead to an insight.
Right.
Even at the time, there was the product managers could go through and, it became very mature, even a part of compensation that said, hey, I have a thing and I've improved that thing. How much of the bottom line did a particular product manager contribute? And that could help with like bonus structures and performance structures.
Yeah.
And so that was really cool, because in my head, it changed that conversation of, hey, we're an analytics team as a cost organization to a profit organization, because we're constantly churning out optimizations. Morale was great. The team was great.
Yeah.
And because it was exciting, right? You're working hand in hand with your stakeholder, with your product manager, not of, hey, what reports can I give you, but how do I help make you more successful? And that's, I think, when analytics becomes fun. Mm-hmm. When the analyst starts to have some skin in the game. The analyst starts to think, hey, wait a second, I want to make my stakeholders more successful. I'm going to be thinking about data. I'm going to be proactive. Like, we're looking at the data. Yeah, we need to hand over reports. Absolutely. There's the basic, scorecard. I've got to deliver that. Reactive standard data. You just need to do this. But when I'm seeing things as an analyst that maybe the, product manager isn't seeing everything. Maybe mm-hmm. I'm seeing areas of opportunities. I'm seeing areas of fallout. I'm seeing targets or segments of the population that could be doing better or worse. If an analyst is able to bring that to the table proactively, and you've got a product manager who's willing to listen, that's when you really start to see that improvement of, hey, now I've got my conversion improving. I'm starting to see different targeted audiences behave better. I'm starting to cater to them more specifically. That's when you start to see, I think, the magic happening.
Yeah. And to clarify, you experienced this certainly at Overstock.
Yeah.
Did you have a similar experience then at T-Mobile?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. It was great. Again, I was running the testing team and then inherited the analytics team. So we did a little bit backwards there, but same sort of thing. Even at the point where it was kind of cool, because I did have a really mature testing team, and they were coming up with their own proactive ideas to test. Hey, look at the data, very, very data driven. What is the data saying? We'll go run the data. Yeah, we ran a lot of tests that were just like, stakeholder says they want to run, is blue button better than green button? And
sure.
We're like, if it helps them adopt testing,
sure.
Fine, we'll do that.
Yeah.
It's not the most valuable test, but it gets their toes in the water. Fine.
It sounds like a very Google-ish test. Testing shades of blue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or, hey, I want to test if size 9 font versus size 10 font is going to make people click on this button. We're like, sure.
Yeah.
Well, it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah.
But absolutely, we'll get you testing. No, but that's where we started to get into saying, how do we do more personalization and optimization, not just true A/B testing. I had a data scientist who was working for me, so I'm just a junior data scientist. It was a lot of fun. It was in the beginning when Adobe, for like 1 minute, they had they had BYOA, bring your own algorithm. They were going to implement that in Target. And we were just like, yay. So I had this really bright guy working for me, and I'm like, do you think we could be part of the beta? And he goes, I think we can just do it. And I was like, what? So I had the data scientist that was working for me, just a junior data scientist. And I'm like, all right, you guys go figure this out. See if we can do this. And it was awesome that we did have that latitude, that my director I was working for at the time was like, yeah, let's go see if we can do this.
Sure.
I want to see if you can be innovative. And so we're like, yeah, which I think it takes the right kind of leader to give that bandwidth to say, you're going to go outside of stakeholder requests only to, we're going to see if we can invent something new and if the payoff is there. Mm-hmm. So I'm very grateful for having, that director at that time, because he allowed us that. But it was great. The guys came back, and data scientist, and I think this kind of got to my cohort I did later on. I was like, okay, go through all the attributes that we're collecting on the website in analytics. Go through all of those and find those that are, like, they have the greatest propensity to actually determining what behavior on the website somebody's doing. We wanted to see, is somebody signed up for a plan, or is somebody signing up are they buying a new phone? What is it? There's like these major journeys. And so he went through and he came back, and I was expecting like, oh, we're gonna have like 25 or 30 of these. He's like, there's 6. There's 6 attributes that are really that's really determining what major journey. We're getting into, we're chasing a long tail. We were just like, hey, this is proof of concept. Let's see if we can do it. So I was like, all right, cool. So he kind of put things, we have a quadrant. Like, what are the 4 different, like, we had maturity, somebody, a new customer, a repeat customer, are they buying a new plan? So we had a quadrant, being able to put all of the customers into a quadrant. And so he created his model, and we're like, all right, let's test if we could run this. The other guy, he was kind of a developer, computer science, really, really smart guy. So I was like, okay, let's see if we can do this. So they created some JavaScript. We put it in through Target, and it worked. It was awesome. But that was like the first foray of, let's get scrappy and see if we could optimize in real time on the fly by just doing it.
So by identifying these 6 characteristics that would indicate that people are headed to one or another very important user journey, you were able to assign them to one of 4 quadrants.
Yeah, it was super basic.
And then to tailor, I assume, their user journey based upon that initial assignment.
Yep. So then you could say, hey, based on what where you've come from, what you've done, these 6 different attributes, we've got different banners that we think you're most likely to be interested in.
Sure.
So do that.
Yeah. Which sounds very much like, the training wheels version of CDP today.
Oh yeah, it was totally training wheels.
Yeah.
Maybe tricycle.
Well, I think the challenge there is not just business and data. It's having the ability to think in a very rigid and systematic fashion and overlay that with creativity.
Yep.
Coloring outside the lines.
Yep. That's a good way to phrase it. I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. To blend that. And I feel like that's where the power comes from. So you're not just building a thing. You're not just marketing a thing, but you're able to blend the two to say, let's build a thing people actually want.
Right. And so from there to AWS.
Yep.
And tell me about the role there and what you learned.
I learned about transformation.
Yes.
There was a rule. I want to say I read it somewhere. I read it on Quora or LinkedIn Learning or somewhere where I liked the concept. It's not how, what was it? It's not how fast you can, like an organization can transform or should transform, but how fast they can transform. So keeping that idea in mind of, because I feel like everywhere I go, they're like, hey, Laura, you're a data person. I want you to come in and build a team from scratch. We're not data driven, but we want you to build a team from scratch, analytics team from scratch, A/B testing from scratch, and we're going to change our whole culture.
Yeah.
And realizing kind of like, there's the easy part is the tech. That's the easy part. Like hiring the people, the change management, the culture shift, that's where the real work comes in. Mm-hmm. And saying, how fast can certain orgs go? And I don't have the answer for that, but it's just like, how much do we, like a team of, I would mention, like some people were like, yeah, you want to test green versus blue? Absolutely. Because it got him in that mindset, right?
Sure.
How much of that do we do? Even though we're like, there's no value to this activity. Well, there's no performance value of that activity. However, there might be cultural value to that activity. And I don't have the answer, but I'm kind of noodling over that. Like, how do you get an organization to start shifting, to get into that mindset? Mm-hmm. Overstock was very, very mature at it. But most other organizations, the concept of using data as an input to form your ideas rather than as a reactive way to reinforce your ideas.
Sure.
I think that's the piece where I'm like, how do you get from reactive, like, oh, this is confirming that my opinion was correct, to this is informing my opinion, and then what are the stages to go from A to B, and what does it take to get there? Because it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
Some orgs might be able to do it in 6 months. Other orgs, it might take them 15 years.
Yeah.
That's where I got the EU cookie policy, though. That's where, so Amazon, mm-hmm. of course, they have Target on their back, of course. Mm-hmm. Any big company, they've got a big Target on their back. EU affirmative cookie consent came down. We had GDPR, CPA hitting us all at once. That was painful. That was super, super painful. I think that was at the time. There was me and my good friend Kalyani. We've been working together for 17 years now. And at the time we were just like, I guess we go find new careers. Like EU cookie consent. Like it's all opt-in.
Right.
Like Nobody's opting in. We were just like, do we go find new jobs? We got to find, I guess this is a time for a career change. Like analytics, this is the end. And so we thought about it and we're like, all right, we're going to do our best. And I think that's where, for both of us, we changed our mindset of, instead of resisting privacy, what if we just embraced it? Mm-hmm. What if we said, I'm not even just going to take the basic recommendations. If I'm in, I'm 100% in. So how do we start rethinking analytics and MarTech with the consumer first? I mean, if you think analytics was late 90s, they came up with it. And there were no privacy regulations. It was the Wild West. They tracked everything.
Right.
And nobody cleared cookies. We didn't know what cookies were. I remember in the beginning, like tracking email addresses, right? Phone numbers.
Which was, by the way, quite exciting from a marketing perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I'm horrified now.
Right, exactly.
But at the time,
it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah, it was a great way to get all this information.
Yeah.
Pass it via public network calls.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's where we started. And so, of course, the easiest thing to do was give everybody an ID. And then we're going to throw them all in a database. And then we're going to sum them all up. We're going to aggregate them. And then we're going to spit out a number up here. And so, how many years later, we're like, wait a second, privacy first. Not everybody needs an individual ID. Do you really need to get the most granular to aggregate those to get the answer that you want from the top? I mean, most marketing campaigns, I don't need to know if Joe, Steve, and John purchased. I need to know, like, what was my return on investment overall, right? And so that's where we said, hey, wait a second, can we get into this idea of measuring at a cohort level? Went back to T-Mobile when I had my data scientist run like how many attributes are really determining the journey of a customer. I mean, every data set's a little bit different, but when it came back 6, I was like, we don't need 200 attributes. We don't need everything about an individual. If 6 attributes are the main determiners, what if we just had like these 6 combinations of cohorts where we could start to say at an aggregate, before somebody's told me who they are, we're still just getting to know each other. At an aggregate, how I can still provide something relevant without being creepy, without asking them too much information, without, so I can keep that trust with the customer. Mm-hmm. I think when you start to, there is that division of relevant, and then it can slide over to creepy. How do we stay on the relevant side?
Yeah.
And that really, so the next bridge, Providence had called me while I was at AWS and was like, hey, we're having some data problems. Could you come fix them for us? And at that time, I was all serious about privacy. I was like, yeah, this whole privacy thing. I love this privacy journey. This is exciting. This is fun. But you have to reinvent it. I can't be thinking about analytics the way I've always thought about analytics. I can't be thinking about MarTech the way we've always thought about it. I just put a cookie on and send their information. So I liked the challenge.
Yeah.
So I said, absolutely, healthcare, let's do this. And so we did. We came up with the challenge.
So at Amazon, given the GDPR implications, were you able to shift instrumentation, shift the approach to analytics and data collection in the way that you envisioned?
No, we didn't do it. And that was another lesson learned is so I think that it did help inform being flexible, trying to do your front-end implementation so that you are vendor agnostic. And so you can be as flexible as possible. Because even if on the front end, we could move very quickly. We were like, yes, we're going to change these IDs. We can implement it this way. We knew what was happening in EU. But the back end was so entrenched and how they had implemented the databases and the data warehouses, they couldn't shift on a dime. It wasn't even an option.
Sure. So you could change collection, but you couldn't change the infrastructure that was the repository for the data that would be collected.
Exactly, especially when you're thinking about something as important as a client ID. Mm-hmm. And I think that really informed once I came to Providence, and even here is what Wheelhouse is doing with the private ID. That's why it's so important to own your own, as a company, to own your own client ID. because you need to feed that into your vendors.
Right.
Because if you're trying to do that always on the back end, and now you've got lots of different IDs, and you can't move quickly because every time somebody introduces a new tool, or hey, wait a second, this vendor doesn't support what we want to support anymore, or hey, now we've got to adopt GDPR, we can't do that method anymore. And now you've got to reinvent your entire data stack.
Yeah.
And so that's where I'm like, no, if you can keep, you own your own client ID, hopefully you own your own backend ID too. That was one we can work on with clients. I know they're
Sure.
using vendor IDs as primary keys. I'm like, no, don't do it. But that way they can move more quickly. And honestly, I think that's like the primary thing that I would say clients need to do is own that and then push that ID, their own client ID, into vendors. So, if we're using Google, I'm like, I don't want to use Google anymore. My business use case has changed. I want to switch over to Adobe. I can do that very easily. Mm-hmm. I'm not like, oh, great. Well, now I've got to redo my entire data stack. Oh, my whole ID graph behind the scenes doesn't even work anymore. Now I've got to add new columns. Now I've got to add new unique IDs. Like, you don't have to. You're like, I'm good to go.
Yeah. So we started working together when you joined Providence as Senior Director of Web Analytics and Insights. You're mentioning this notion of a private client ID, which was the genesis for the HIPAA compliant analytics solution that we jointly developed. Talk a little bit more about that. Talk about how conventional or historically analytics and tracking worked versus the notion of having a private client ID.
Oh, yeah. And honestly, one of my big soapboxes about this, I know healthcare is kind of last to digital analytics. In this case, I think healthcare is leading.
Yeah,
honestly,
I
think
agree.
Everybody should implement this way going forward, period. It should be non-optional.
Right.
So ordinarily, if you're talking basic, let's say web analytics, any MarTech, client-side MarTech, you're running a JavaScript library on your website. The JavaScript library belongs to Adobe, or it belongs to Google, or it belongs to Mixpanel, or it belongs to, SideSpec, whatever. You're running a client-side JavaScript library, which is setting an ID in a cookie to understand this is Laura Chase, right? So they're running that and then collecting data that's tied to that ID throughout every single thing I'm doing on the website. Different page loads, different clicks, different, as I'm navigating, they're collecting that data, tying it to that visitor ID. Now, Adobe or Google or whoever you're using will ingest all of that data into their servers. They're going to process that and spit that back out to reports in their tool that show, how many visits did I get this week? How many visitors clicked on this one thing? What did these paths look like? So they can aggregate all that. And so I think that's fine. That worked for many, many years. When you come to cookie compliance or you come to HIPAA compliance, now you've got somebody's third-party JavaScript sitting on your site, which means they're creating their visitor ID and sending that information, which includes, IP address, the full URL, anything about this person, they're sending that to their servers to process. Now that becomes a problem because HIPAA says IP address, certain URLs, any information that could be like an account ID, any open text field. All that will be sent to a third-party server, which could contain ePHI, electric, PHI. So that's part of the problem. And so with healthcare, that's where we said, we can implement server sides where instead of pushing this data to, say, a Google server, we can push that into we can at least collect from the client into our servers, and then we can push like a subset over into like a cleansed version into Google or Adobe. But I didn't necessarily like that idea of, well, wait a second, if I have their client-side JavaScript, their ID service on my website, it's still communicating to their server, which means I'm still sharing an IP address. Also, I'm locked into that vendor. If I'm using somebody else's client-side ID, I'm stuck with them.
Right.
And so there was two parts of it. One is trying to be vendor agnostic, and the second part was saying, I don't want somebody else's code on my client-side website. The relationship is between the customer and me, not the customer and Google. It's my trust that gets burned if something happens, and Google does it, but it's my trust with the customer that gets burned.
Yeah.
So let's just remove them completely. And so that was kind of the idea of, hey, we've got to have our own ID. Wheelhouse took it one step further and built us like the ID graph, which is even better. And so then we could control our own ID, and then pushing everything server side. And now server side, that's where we could say, hey, I want these 5 variables to go to Adobe, but I don't want all the variables. I only need 5 to answer my business use cases.
Right.
Maybe I'll send 10 over to my internal data warehouse because maybe I have a CDP that does have, private cloud. So that was kind of the idea there.
Yeah.
I would love to take private ID even a step further, where it becomes not just an ID that's run through your tag manager, but it becomes a client-side ID that you load with the page. So it becomes an ID service, and now you can push that into, say, your A/B testing tool. You push that into your personalization tool. You push that through your tag manager into the tags that are running there. That would give you a native integration between all of your client-side tool, like all of your client-side data sets. So now you don't have to do a bunch of ID lookups on your back end. I can also start to push data at an ID level of, hey, I want to see how are my different personalization segments, and maybe I'm using a different tool, and I want to push that into my Adobe data set so I can slice and dice my data by my personalization cohorts.
Right.
And now I can do that through like a client ID, an anonymous client ID that I control, that I push into all of my third-party vendors.
Yeah. And there are a couple of important implications to what you're describing as well. The first is that one of the risks, one of the things that's problematic about using a third-party ID is that the PHI that they collect may not be directly collected from your site. It may be PHI that is developed based upon what they learned from you plus what they already knew.
Yes.
And if you don't have a BA in place with them, which you're not going to have with most major platform providers, then you've created a problem. And the second, and you've touched on this a few times, is that because the ID is a third-party ID, you do have vendor lock-in. So you could switch, for example, analytics providers, but then all of the historical data is based on a different ID structure, ID graph, and integrating that historical data with new data is a monumental task. Whereas having a private ID means that you have identity continuity regardless of the vendors with whom you interact. And because that ID is yours, it can't be joined with something that another third party knows.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point that I hadn't even thought of. It is keeping that relationship between you and the customer.
Yeah.
It doesn't leak. Even if a third party grabbed this idea, it means nothing to them.
Right.
Nothing. They're like, I can't tie it anywhere else.
Yeah. And so what do you think are the implications now for the rapid pace of privacy regulation, rollout, and development, for Google declaring, finally, at long last, that they will deprecate support for third-party cookies, for everything that's happening in healthcare? Where do you think we're headed in terms of analytics, data strategy, data collection?
It's awesome. It is about time. Wheelhouse is ahead of the game here. I think for a long time, if people were relying on third-party data, it was kind of like, I don't know, it's looking into a mirror that's more of a portrait than a mirror, because mobile hasn't been using third-party data for a long, long time. And Safari hasn't, and so it hasn't really been working anyway.
Right.
And so even though we were relying on it, I'm just like, but it was kind of a half-truth. And then also, it's about time. I know there's a lot of resistance, and I'm not an ad tech person. I'll state that I am biased.
Sure.
But I do think it's about time that consumers, they take back their privacy from the internet. I think there's certain times, and it does depend. There's certain times, I was thinking about it earlier, okay, if I'm shopping for a sofa, and I'm looking at sofas for the next 3 weeks, I'm targeted for sofas. all different, I'm on social media, different social media sites. I'm targeted for sofas. My partner's targeted for sofas. My children are targeted for sofas. Everybody's on board to get a new sofa. Like, that's okay. Let's say I'm looking up like a very private, mental health diagnosis. I'm not so happy if that's being shared with my partner or my social media. And, now I'm feeling that's a little bit creepy. And so I think for a long time, advertising did go down that road. And they did, and it was creepy. And they kind of got away with it for a while. So I'm like, it's about time. And it's also time, I had my epiphany at AWS when I was like, do I quit my career? And I was like, no, we embrace this. There's a better way out there. We can do it better. We don't have to rely on the technology that was created in 1997. Like, it's about time that we do it better. So I think innovation. It's there for us, and not just AI. I think AI can be still a little bit creepy when they're trying to use AI for nefarious. Oh, I'm going to try to determine who you are without you telling me. I think that's still a little too far. Like, let's respect the boundaries and say, okay, person, I'm going to respect your boundaries. As soon as I log in, I want that company to know me. They better tell me my preferences. That's what the login is for. But until we've done that, until we've crossed that, I think just trying to not get that breach of trust. You can build your customers. And how awesome would it be if at some point in the future, instead of accepting, do you accept all of our cookies? You opt in or out? What if you had a banner that says, we don't make you opt in or opt out because we don't collect any data that would require that?
Sure.
What would that do to your competitors?
Yeah.
If you're like, I don't collect any private data, period. I'm working on creating a relevant, because I'm not going to get rid of analytics or advertising or marketing. I still want to create a very relevant experience without crossing that line.
Yeah.
But I was like, how awesome to shame your competitors if you're like, hey, we're not collecting any private data, so you don't have to opt in or opt out.
Yeah.
We just don't do it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting to explore. So again, thinking about healthcare specifically, it's not the act of collection that's problematic. It's the act of sharing that's problematic. Yep. And so you could create a paradigm in which you're collecting everything that you need to understand the use and utility and experiences on your website, but also just have a declared policy that you don't share that data with anybody outside of your four walls.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think it's, we don't want to do that, hey, we're not going to collect any data. I still want to create, I think the expectation from customers is I want a relevant experience.
Right.
So I don't want something that's completely like, I can't find anything I want. Like, you're targeting me for stuff that doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
So still creating a relevant experience, but not going into that line of, I didn't even tell you that. How'd you know that about me? That's you crossed that line.
Okay, so this year, let's say things play out the way that they're supposed to, the way that they've been declared or announced, which they won't because they never do, particularly where Google is involved. But Google deprecates third-party cookies, the privacy sandbox is implemented, things continue as they have with analytics in healthcare, which they need to, given the OCR guidance and HIPAA application to patients and non-patients. If we were to project 2 or 3 years into the future, what do you think data collection analytics looks like? How is it accomplished? What do we have? What do we not have? How are we effective?
Yeah, and so there's the part where with technology, I think Dustin and I could solve it, but that doesn't solve the change management.
Sure, yeah.
And so I was like, well, healthcare and culture is still going to take a little while.
Yeah.
I would love to see if the way the industry is, or I guess the way I would like to see the industry go, if different websites and different companies start taking back all of their customers' data from Google. Google's looking at their Flock IDs and stuff like that, which is basically Cohort IDs, but they're doing it in browser, right? But they still control the game. Right. I would love to see if companies are doing more like healthcare that says, I'm collecting enough to be relevant. Absolutely. The trust is built between me and my customer. But like you're saying, I'm not sharing that data. That data, that's our relationship. I'll share that data. I'll keep that data internally. I'm not going to share that data with Google. I'm not sharing it with Facebook. I'll swap some random IDs with those, but your data's safe with us. I would love to see, I think healthcare is starting it because they have to, but I would love to see all websites end up going that route.
Yeah. We've been pushed not just in that direction, but to do just that with some of our larger healthcare clients with regard to advertising.
Yeah.
Because we have access, we have a HIPAA compliant data warehouse, we have access to PHI, we can learn things from that data. And we can learn things specifically with regard to the efficacy of the advertising we run and the channels in which we're performing well and the messages and also some of the targeting that we're able to do. But we have a wall between analytics and advertising. And so our analysts can learn and they can then apply what they learned, but they do it without the data. They do it through synthesizing and then making decisions. And that's worked really well. It's learning a different way to go about this and also creating a context in which they have access to data that they can easily synthesize and interpret and then turn into action. They don't have to roll around in spreadsheets like they used to do years ago.
Some of us liked that.
Yes. Yeah. It still can be fun, but not when the spreadsheets get too big.
That's true.
Which they are today.
No, but I do like that because it's if you're using the data for analysis, that's fine. I mean, there's a rich amount of just healthcare data in general, but it's not giving that to, like, that relationship is between, the caregiver and the customer, the caregiver and the patient. That has nothing to do with Google, has nothing to do with Facebook, has nothing to do with, advertising on ESPN. That's that finite relationship. And so I think safeguarding that relationship would be paramount.
Yeah. Have you looked much at the Privacy Sandbox?
I haven't recently.
Yeah.
I knew that they were working on Flock a couple years ago, and I was like, that's my idea.
Sure, yeah.
But I just didn't want to do it at the browser level because I'm like, well, they're kind of solving it, but they still control the data.
Yeah, that's exactly what they've done. The Privacy Sandbox is still, Google has all of the information and you get none or very little.
Yeah.
It's still, to a significant extent, some conventional ad ecosystem, but instead of being server to server, they've moved it all into the browser. Okay. So it just lives in Chrome.
Okay, yeah, that's it. And I'm just like, I still don't want Google to have that data.
Right.
It goes back to, what's, for me anyway, and I would hope, especially healthcare, is such a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
Is the relationship doesn't belong with, me and Google. The relationship belongs with me and my caregiver, me and my doctor. It has nothing. So it's like keep those third parties out.
There's so much about this that to me feels like a return to more conventional interpersonal relationships where you actually strike a relationship with a provider or an entity. You give them permission to communicate with you. And then from a marketing perspective, a return to the fundamentals of good marketing, which is you understand your audience.
Yes.
You are very thoughtful about the messages that you develop and the creative that you use to communicate those messages. You pay very close attention to that and you tune based on creative as opposed to, I think that in digital advertising, we have been, for far too long, able to be quite lazy.
Yep.
You just come up with a campaign as quickly as you can and 5 variations of that campaign, and you throw it out there. It's something that approximates the audience that you want to hit. Yep. And then you look at the data and you refine based on that, kind of a spray and pray method.
Yep.
And you won't be able to do that anymore. So you have to be a better marketer.
Yeah.
Which I think is good for everybody.
We'll have to up our game.
That's right.
Yeah. No, it's true because I love that you call that lazy marketing because I would do the same thing. When I've got 2 teenagers, me and my partner, we're looking at social media, and then all of a sudden my partner, a 52-year-old man, is like, "How come I'm getting like teenage skincare recommendations?"
Right.
It's like, well, that's the 14-year-old upstairs.
Yes.
And I get so angry because I'm like, that's lazy marketing.
Right.
They're just using IP address. That's lazy.
Yeah.
I'm like, and you're on social media. You already told them everything you're interested in.
Yeah.
And they're still doing lazy. So I love that you call it that because I'm like, I agree. That's lazy marketing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so as we think about folks who are in analytics and healthcare, thinking about how to navigate the current circumstance, thinking about the steps to put in place now, the things to put in place now to anticipate what will happen over the next few years, what advice would you have for them?
I would say embrace the privacy. Don't fight against it. Embrace it. There's a way to be a better analyst. There's a way to be a better marketer. And so we don't have to hang on to the old things. Also, I think the next goal I would recommend is controlling your own data. For so long, I think we relied on, I've got 2 lines of JavaScript. And we had to use whatever the vendors told us was available. And I think now there's the option of saying, they're a tool, and they're a good tool to get to the end, but I'm not going to give them my data. Some of them are really good at data collection. Some of them are really good at operations within the data. But ultimately, it's the company's data. We don't have to share it. We can use them for what our needs are without, giving away the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. Any particular direction or recommendations from a technical perspective, ways to frame technical decisions that they're making, MarTech decisions that they may be considering?
I would say definitely look to own your own visitor ID, period. That's number one. That's absolutely paramount. I think from a technology standpoint, it's like, what direction do we do? Trying to get a data system, whether that's a tag manager, it doesn't matter what it is, where, again, you're controlling your own data. You're able to pare down which data am I sending to which vendor. Having that control. Again, it's the control of your own data. Hey, I've got some vendors I just want to send a light amount of data. I've got other vendors, maybe I need more of that data. But that way I'm kind of controlling what data goes where. As far as so all that costs a lot of money.
It can, yes.
How do you as an analyst, which is usually seen, again, it goes back to the cost center.
Yeah.
How do you, who's usually seen as a cost center, start to break into those conversations with your leadership team of, wait a second, we want to be seen as an opportunity center. Tied, absolutely, 100%, start today. Start tying your data and your analytics to testing so you can measure the value of those insights. Because as soon as you can measure the value of those insights, now you've got a dollar amount that you can go back to your leadership team with that says, this is the value of this program we implemented. It's not just sunk costs that we kind of have to write every year, but we're actually seeing profits come out of this, previous cost center so that we can keep the machine running.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. It's good advice. Well, thank you for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
It has been fun.
I get to talk about things I really like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.